Everyone loves a success story, especially when it starts from nothing and becomes something big. That's what makes the story of Paul Teutul Jr. so powerful. Many people know him as the creative mind from the hit TV show American Chopper, but few know how his journey really began. Before the lights, the cameras, and the fame, there was just a young man with a passion for building something great. His story didn't start in a big shop or on TV. It started in a small garage with grease on his hands and big dreams in his heart. Paul Jr. was born into a world of metal, tools, and engines. His father, Paul Tuchil Jr., owned Orange County Iron Works, a company that built steel structures. That's where Paul Jr. learned the basics. He watched and learned, slowly building his skills. It wasn't long before he joined the family business and began showing a natural talent for design and mechanics. Unlike many others, he didn't just want to build motorcycles, he wanted to make them into art. This vision was different, bold, and full of personality. People around him started to notice. His bikes weren't just machines, they were stories told through chrome and paint. Whether it was a theme bike for a company or a tribute to a firefighter, Paul Jr. added small touches that made each one special. His designs had emotion, something rarely seen in motorcycle building. That was the beginning of something much bigger than he could imagine. When American Chopper started airing in 2003 on the Discovery Channel, it changed everything. The world finally saw what Paul Jr. could do. He became the breakout star of the show. His attention to detail, creative vision, and calm personality stood out. Viewers loved seeing how he turned raw metal into custom motorcycles with soul. Every bike told a story, and Paul Jr. was the storyteller. But behind the fame and growing success, something else was happening. Something that no one could see right away. The spotlight brought pressure, the cameras followed every move, the deadlines became tighter. And the creative process, something Paul Jr. loved, started to feel more like a job than a passion. People saw the finished product, the cool bikes and the smiles. They didn't see the sleepless nights, the stress, or the tension building within the shop. One thing that stood out to viewers from the beginning was Paul Jr.'s relationship with his father. At first it looked like a typical father-son team, one providing leadership, the other bringing fresh ideas. But as time went on, cracks began to show. The two often clashed. Their arguments became a regular part of the show. Sometimes it felt like the fights were more famous than the bikes themselves. The creative differences turned personal. It was no longer just about the bikes. It became about pride, control, and respect. Fans started to wonder, how long could they keep working together like this? Could Paul Jr. keep creating under so much pressure and conflict? These questions added to the show's appeal, but they also pointed to something much deeper happening behind the scenes. Paul Jr., once just a kid with a dream, was now stuck in a cycle of stress and emotional battles that slowly began to wear him down. Still, he kept going. Each season brought more amazing bikes and more fame, but viewers could tell that something wasn't quite right. Paul Jr. looked tired. The joy that once showed on his face during builds began to fade. There were fewer laughs and more silence, more serious faces, more tension. It made people wonder, was the dream starting to fall apart? Even with all that going on, Paul Jr. never gave up on the quality of his work. He continued to push the limits of what a custom motorcycle could be. He worked harder. He stayed focused. But deep down, something had changed. The garage that once felt like home now felt like a battlefield. And the father he once looked up to became someone he couldn't agree with. This part of Paul Jr.'s life is important because it shows that success isn't always easy. Just because someone is on TV or is famous doesn't mean their life is perfect. Paul Jr. was living his dream, but he was also paying a price that didn't show up in the headlines or on the covers of magazines. People close to Paul Jr. say he has always been quiet, thoughtful, and deeply creative. He wasn't the kind of person who chased fame, he just wanted to build great bikes. That's what makes this story even more emotional, because when someone with pure passion ends up in a storm of fame, pressure, and family drama, it hurts to watch. You want them to succeed, but you also want them to be at peace. And maybe that's what makes his story so human. Because we all chase our dreams. We all want to be known for something great, but sometimes the very thing we love can become the thing that hurts us. Paul Jr.'s rise wasn't just about motorcycles, it was about a young man trying to hold on to his passion in a world that kept pulling him in different directions. Even now, people remember those early seasons of American Chopper and the magic Paul Jr. brought to each design. They remember the smile when a bike was finished, the spark in his eye when a vision came to life. That spark is what made fans fall in love with him. And that's why so many were heartbroken when things started to fall apart later. But that part of the story comes next. For now, this was his rise. a rise filled with talent, hope, and a storm quietly forming in the background. Every family has its own story. Some families are close and peaceful, others are full of loud voices, big emotions, and strong personalities. The Tuchil family was definitely the second kind. Paul Tuchil Jr. did not just grow up learning how to build with metal and tools. He grew up in a house where strength, pride, and power were always present. His father, Paul Tuchil Sam, was not a quiet man. He was loud, strong-willed, and used to doing things his own way. That energy followed him into the garage, and into the TV screen. When American Chopper began, it wasn't just about building custom bikes. It was about watching a real family work together, fight together, and try to make something great. At first it was exciting. Paul Sam and Paul Jr. had something special. They were father and son, but also teacher and student, boss and worker. They had chemistry. When things went well, it was like watching two artists at work. But when things went wrong, it felt like watching a storm roll in slowly, then crash all at once. Paul Jr. respected his father. He learned everything from him: how to weld, how to shape metal, how to lead a shop. But respect doesn't always mean agreement. Paul Jr. had his own way of thinking. He liked to plan, design, and create carefully. He was a quiet thinker. His father, on the other hand, was all about power, control, and fast results. He believed in discipline and hard work, but sometimes his way of showing it was too harsh. That difference created a wall between them, even when they were building bikes side by side. The fights became part of the show. At first, fans thought they were just for entertainment, but over time the arguments got more serious. The shouting was real, the slamming doors were real, and the tension. You could feel it through the screen. Viewers started to realize that this wasn't just drama for TV. This was a real family breaking down in front of millions of people. People started asking questions. How could a father and son fight so much? Why didn't they just walk away? The truth was more complicated. The shop, Orange County Choppers, was their life. It was more than just a business. It was where Paul Jr. grew up. It was the place where he became a man, a designer, and eventually a star. Leaving it meant walking away from everything he had built with his own hands. But staying meant dealing with a father who didn't always understand or support his ideas. In many episodes you could see Paul Jr. trying to stay calm while his father raised his voice. You could see him take deep breaths, look away, or try to explain himself. But no matter how much he tried, it seemed like his father was never really listening. And that hurts more than anything, because when your own parent doesn't hear you, it feels like you don't matter. That silent pain grew inside Paul Jr., and slowly the love for the job started to turn into frustration. Behind the scenes, things weren't easy either. The pressure to deliver bikes on time, the cameras watching their every move, and the stress of fame all added fuel to the fire. Every small disagreement turned into a big fight. Every mistake became personal. Paul Sommer didn't like to be challenged, and Paul Jr. didn't want to just follow orders. They were both strong, smart, and passionate, but in very different ways. And that difference made working together almost impossible. There were moments when things seemed better. You'd see them laugh, share a memory, or agree on a design, and for a second it looked like they could fix their relationship. But those moments never lasted long. Something would always go wrong, and just like that the shouting would start again. Some fans took sides. Some said Paul Jr. was lazy or disrespectful. Others said Paul Sommer was a bully. But the truth is, both were right and both were wrong. Paul Jr. wasn't lazy, he was thoughtful. He needed time to think and plan. Paul Sommer wasn't just a bully, he was an old-school leader who believed in tough love. But no matter how you saw it, the result was the same: two men who wanted to build something great but kept breaking each other in the process. Paul Jr.'s younger brother Mikey was often caught in the middle. He tried to bring peace, he tried to make them laugh, to calm the fights, to keep the shop running. But even Mikey couldn't stop the damage. Watching your family fall apart, especially in front of the world, is a heavy weight to carry, and that weight was now on everyone in the shop. Over time, the relationship between Paul Sommer and Paul Jr. got worse. Trust faded. Communication broke down. Paul Jr. began to feel like he wasn't wanted in the place he helped build. And when you don't feel valued, you start thinking about walking away. That idea, once impossible, started to feel like the only option. This part of Paul Jr.'s story isn't just about a business or a TV show. It's about a son who wanted to make his father proud, but kept hearing that he wasn't good enough. It's about a man who had dreams, but was told to do things differently. It's about the pain of family, the kind of pain that doesn't leave bruises but leaves scars. As viewers, we saw the bikes, the paint, the steel. But behind all of that was a broken relationship that no camera could fully capture. And that's what makes this part of the story so real. Because many people can relate. Maybe not with building bikes, but with wanting to be seen, to be respected, to be heard by someone they love. Paul Jr. stayed longer than most people would. He stayed through the yelling, the stress, and the emotional weight. Maybe because he hoped things would change. Maybe because he believed in the work. Or maybe because deep down he still wanted his father's approval. But sometimes, no matter how hard you try, love alone isn't enough to fix a relationship. And just like that, viewers began to wonder how much more could he take? How long could he keep building in a place where his heart was breaking? Fame can be a strange thing. It seems like a dream come true when you first taste it. People recognize you, they want to hear what you have to say, and they cheer for your successes. But what happens when that fame starts to feel less like a blessing and more like a heavy weight on your shoulders? That's exactly what happened to Paul Teutul Jr. as American Chopper became more popular. At first it was all fun, designing incredible bikes, working alongside his father and building something that people loved. But as the show grew, so did the pressure. The cameras weren't just following his designs, they were following his every move. And that's when things started to change. It was hard to see at first. Paul Jr. kept his cool. He stayed focused on the bikes. But behind that calm exterior, something was building inside him. The demands of being on TV were starting to take their toll. Every day felt like a performance. The cameras were always rolling, even when he just wanted to take a break. There was no private moment. There was no space to breathe. Paul Jr. had to be on all the time. And while he loved his work, the constant attention wore him down. The constant filming and media attention were exhausting. What began as a fun opportunity to showcase his talent became a 24/7 job. The crew followed him around even when he was just working in the shop, just trying to get a design right. That constant presence made it harder for Paul Jr. to focus. He was no longer just building bikes for the joy of creating something new. Now he was building for ratings, for the show, and for the camera. It wasn't just about the bike anymore. It was about the next big moment, the next great line for the show, the next dramatic scene. It was hard for him to find the line between reality and performance. At the same time, there was the pressure to deliver. The fans expected something amazing every time. They wanted new designs, new ideas, new bikes that pushed the limits. The pressure to constantly outdo himself took away the fun. There was no room for mistakes, no room for the creative process to breathe. Every bike had to be perfect and on time. For someone as passionate about his craft as Paul Jr., that pressure was a challenge he didn't expect. Fame also meant more than just the cameras. It meant more people watching his every move, more people giving their opinions, more people judging his work. The world was watching him, and with that came both praise and criticism. At first the praise felt good. He was being recognized for his talent and his creativity. But soon the criticism started to feel personal. Every choice he made, every decision about a bike was being picked apart. Fans of the show became armchair designers, offering opinions on how Paul Jr. could have done things better. They didn't see the hours of hard work and dedication that went into each bike. All they saw was the finished product, and they expected perfection. But it wasn't just the fans who were critical. Paul Sr., his own father, was also a source of stress. As American Chopper continued to grow, their relationship became more tense. The pressure to succeed wasn't just coming from outside. It was coming from within the family too. Paul Sr. wasn't just a father, he was also his boss. And as the show became bigger, their fights became more public. The disagreements weren't just about the bikes anymore. They were about the future of the company, the direction of the show, and their roles within it. Paul Jr.'s creative ideas didn't always match with what his father wanted. They both had different visions for what Orange County Choppers should be, and that difference became harder to ignore as the business grew. But there was something even bigger at play here. As Paul Jr. became more famous, he started to feel like the work he loved was slipping away. The passion that once fueled him began to fade. It wasn't just the bikes or the family drama, it was the business side of things. The commercial aspect of the show took over. He found himself spending more time in meetings, talking to producers, and dealing with contracts than actually building bikes. The thing that brought him joy, the act of creating, was now a small part of the bigger machine. The show was becoming less about the art of the craft and more about the business of fame. And the fame wasn't all it seemed. While he was getting more recognition, it also meant less privacy. Every part of his life was under the microscope. The fans wanted to know everything: what he was eating, where he was going, who he was talking to. It was like he was living in a glass box. He couldn't even have a normal day without someone watching or talking about him. The constant spotlight made it harder to keep his personal life separate from his professional life. His relationships, his emotions, and even his free time felt like they belonged to the world. The pressure, the constant attention, and the growing tension with his father all built up. Paul Jr. started to feel like he was losing himself. The dreams he once had of building bikes and creating art were being buried under the weight of fame, and that's when he began to realize that fame wasn't all it was cracked up to be. It had taken away his peace, his privacy, and his passion for the work. It had put him in a place where he felt trapped, stuck between the need to keep the show going and the desire to get back to what he loved most, creating without the pressure of cameras and deadlines. As the pressure continued to grow, Paul Jr. had to ask himself an important question: was it worth it? Was all the fame and success worth losing his joy, his peace, and his relationship with his father? The world saw a rising star, but Paul Jr. was starting to see the cracks in the foundation. Fame, it seemed, came with a price. For every new bike that was built, for every new design that impressed the fans, Paul Jr.'s soul seemed to be getting further away from the dream he once had. His love for the craft had turned into a need to satisfy the demands of others. And the cost of that was something only he could feel. Behind every smile, behind every perfect bike, there was a growing emptiness. The cameras were still rolling, but Paul Jr. wasn't sure how much longer he could keep pretending everything was okay. And so as the fame grew, the cost became clearer. How much more could he take? Was it possible to reclaim the joy of creation in a world that demanded constant perfection? The answer to that question would soon become a turning point in his life. But for now, Paul Jr. was caught in the middle of fame, pressure, and a desire to find peace once again. No one could have predicted the moment when everything would fall apart. For years, American Chopper had captured the world's attention. Fans loved seeing the wild designs and the drama between Paul Tuchil Jr. and his father Paul Tuchil Sr., but behind the scenes, the cracks were already there. The tension was building, and the pressure of working in the same shop with so many cameras and expectations was becoming too much. No matter how hard Paul Jr. tried to keep things together, something had to give. And when it did, it wasn't just the end of a chapter in his career, it was the end of something that had been a huge part of his life. At first, the tension felt like it was just part of the show. The disagreements between Paul Jr. and his father had become a familiar part of the storyline. Fans were used to seeing the father and son argue, but they didn't realize how deep those arguments really went. They didn't know how much it hurt Paul Jr. to constantly clash with his father. They didn't see how those arguments were eroding not just their relationship but his love for the work he had once been so passionate about. But one day everything changed. The breaking point came when Paul Jr. realized that he could no longer stay in a situation that was slowly eating away at him. His dream of creating custom motorcycles had become a nightmare. The constant pressure from the cameras, the fights with his father, and the never-ending demand for perfection had left him feeling drained. It wasn't just the stress of the job, it was the emotional toll it took on him. He had always tried to keep his head down, focus on the work, and push through the tension. But it became clear that no amount of effort could fix what was broken. The environment was toxic. He couldn't keep pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. The final straw came when Paul Jr. was told he had to leave. His father Paul Sr. had made it clear that things weren't going to change. The constant bickering, the lack of respect, and the disagreements over the direction of the business had finally reached a point where there was no turning back. It wasn't just a business decision, it was personal. And Paul Jr. felt like he had no choice but to walk away. Leaving wasn't easy. In fact, it felt like losing everything he had worked so hard to build. The shop, the bikes, the TV show, it all had to be left behind. But Paul Jr. knew that staying would only destroy him more. It was a painful decision, but deep down he understood that it was the only way to reclaim his life. The decision to walk away from American Chopper and the family business was not just about leaving a show, it was about protecting himself, his creativity, and his sense of self-worth. People outside the family didn't fully understand the depth of what Paul Jr. was going through. They saw the show, the bikes, and the family drama, but they didn't see the hours of hard work, the emotional strain, and the constant pressure. Fans were shocked when he left, many of them feeling betrayed or confused. They had grown attached to Paul Jr. and his journey, and seeing him walk away from it all seemed like a betrayal of sorts. But what they didn't see was how deeply Paul Jr. had suffered. They didn't see how every argument, every fight, and every decision to stay in a toxic environment had chipped away at his passion for what he once loved. When Paul Jr. left, it felt like the end of an era. For the fans, for the show, and even for his father, it seemed like a huge loss. But what the world didn't realize at that moment was that Paul Jr. wasn't giving up. He was choosing to rebuild his life. He wasn't walking away from motorcycles or from his dream of creating. He was walking away from a situation that had taken the joy out of everything he once loved. And as painful as it was to leave, it also opened up new opportunities for him to finally create without the pressure of fame, family conflict, and the cameras. The decision to leave was not an easy one, and it wasn't just about the business. It was also about Paul Jr.'s personal life. Over the years, he had been in the public eye so much that it became hard to separate who he was from what people expected him to be. It was no longer just about motorcycles, it was about being Paul Jr. from American Chopper. But that wasn't the real him. The real Paul Jr. was a creative mind who loved to design, who loved the process of building something from scratch, and who wanted to be recognized for his work, not just for the drama of a TV show. But now, as he walked away from the show and the family business, Paul Jr. had to find out who he was without the cameras and the drama. He had to rebuild not just his career, but his identity. He didn't know exactly what the future held, but he knew that he couldn't keep living the way he was. He had to break free from the toxic environment that had been dragging him down for so long. At the same time, he wasn't ready to completely leave motorcycles behind. It was in his blood. It was what he had done his whole life. So instead of walking away from bikes, he chose to start over. He opened his own shop, Paul Jr. Designs, and began focusing on creating custom motorcycles on his own terms. It was a fresh start, but it was also a scary one. Leaving American Chopper meant stepping into the unknown. There were no cameras, no father to work with, and no guarantee that anyone would care about his work without the show's backing. But that's the thing about breaking points. Sometimes, they force you to make a decision that you wouldn't have made otherwise. And even though it felt like losing everything, it turned out to be the best decision Paul Jr. It gave him the freedom to focus on what he truly loved, without the distractions of the past. The journey to rebuild was difficult, but it was also necessary. Paul Jr.'s decision to leave American Chopper wasn't just about walking away from a job, it was about reclaiming his life. It was about taking control of his own future and finding his own path. It wasn't easy, and it didn't come without pain. But it was the beginning of something new. And sometimes, you need to hit rock bottom before you can rise again. After leaving American Chopper, Paul Tuchil Jr. faced a future that felt uncertain. For so long, his life had been tied to the fame, the show, and the constant pressure to perform. Walking away was one of the hardest things he ever had to do. It felt like he was leaving behind everything he had worked for, but deep inside he knew it was the only way forward. The decision to leave his father's shop, to walk away from the chaos, was not just about escaping, it was about finding himself again. In the years leading up to his departure, Paul Jr. had lost something that was very important to him. His passion, what once brought him joy, designing bikes, creating unique pieces, and building his dream had become overshadowed by stress, tension, and the weight of the cameras. The very thing he loved had started to drain him, and the only way he could reclaim his joy was to step away from it all and start fresh. But starting fresh was not easy. There was no safety net. There was no show or huge following to back him up. Paul Jr. had to rebuild from the ground up, and it was scary. He didn't have the same kind of platform he once had. He wasn't a star on TV anymore. Now he was just another designer trying to make a name for himself in a world that had already seen him in the spotlight. He had to prove that he wasn't just Paul from American Chopper, he was Paul Tuchil Jr., a talented designer with his own unique ideas. The first step was opening his own shop, Paul Jr. Designs. It wasn't easy, there was a lot of pressure on him, but this time it was different. The pressure wasn't coming from a TV show or the constant need to perform. It was just Paul Jr., the bikes and his dreams. And for the first time in a long time he could focus on the work without worrying about the drama that had consumed his life for so many years. He could take his time, make the designs he wanted, and do what he loved without anyone looking over his shoulder. But the road to success wasn't smooth. There were times when Paul Jr. wondered if he had made the right choice. The world had moved on. People weren't talking about American Chopper anymore. And there were moments when he questioned whether his new shop would ever succeed. He had a name, but that name didn't guarantee anything. He had to work hard to prove himself all over again. He had to show the world that he still had what it took to create incredible bikes, that he could still capture people's imaginations without the drama of the show. What Paul Jr. discovered, though, was that there was something very freeing about working outside the spotlight. He wasn't just designing bikes anymore, he was rebuilding his life. It wasn't just about making money or getting recognition. It was about doing something he truly loved, and for the first time in years he could feel the excitement of creation again. The freedom to work at his own pace, without the pressure of deadlines or being in front of a camera, reignited his passion, and that was something he hadn't realized he was missing until it was gone. As Paul Jr. settled into his new life, he realized that he had also built something that was even more important than just a career. He had started to rebuild his relationships. Walking away from his father's business had not just been about leaving a job, it had been about stepping away from toxic situations. The constant tension with his father had been draining. But by leaving, Paul Jr. started to give himself the space to heal. He didn't have to prove himself to anyone anymore. He was free to live his life on his own terms, without the constant weight of expectations, and as he built his new life, he also began to heal emotionally. One of the most difficult parts of starting fresh was accepting that not everything would be perfect. Paul Jr. knew that success didn't happen overnight. He had to start small, build a reputation, and get clients who trusted his work. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was possible. And he was determined to make it happen. The first few months were tough. There were moments when he questioned if he had made the right decision. He missed the team he had worked with, the fans who had supported him, and even the drama that came with the show. But as time went on, he began to see that he was better off without it all. One of the most important lessons Paul Jr. learned during this time was that rebuilding wasn't just about building a business, it was about rebuilding his confidence. The years of working in a toxic environment had taken a toll on his self-esteem. He didn't realize how much of his identity had been wrapped up in the show, in the drama, and in the success of the family business. But as he began to create on his own, he started to see himself differently. He was no longer just the son of Paul Jr., he was Paul Tuchil Jr., a talented designer with his own voice, his own vision, and his own future. The shop began to grow. Slowly but surely, Paul Jr. started to build a loyal following of customers who appreciated his work. They didn't care about the drama from the past, they cared about the bikes, they cared about the designs. And most importantly, they cared about Paul Jr. as a person. The fact that he was doing things his own way, on his own terms, was inspiring. People saw that he had fought through adversity and come out the other side stronger, more focused, and more determined than ever. As Paul Jr. found his footing in the world of custom bikes, he also found a new sense of peace. The emotional strain that had been a constant part of his life was finally starting to fade. He had walked away from the chaos, and now he was free. He could focus on what mattered most, his love for motorcycles, his creativity, and his sense of purpose. He had regained the passion he once had, and he was no longer just living for the cameras or the approval of others. But there was still one question on his mind: could he ever repair his relationship with his father? That question remained unanswered for a long time. Even though Paul Jr. had found success and peace on his own, the rift between him and Paul Jr. was still there. But he had learned to accept that some things take time. He had made the decision to leave for his own well-being, and he couldn't force things to change. If reconciliation was going to happen, it would have to come on its own. For now, Paul Jr. was content with where he was, focusing on his work and his new life, knowing that things could improve in time. That rebuilding his life wasn't easy, but it was the best decision Paul Jr. had ever made. He had found his passion again, and he was no longer living in the shadow of the past. He had learned that sometimes, you need to walk away from something that no longer serves you in order to build something better. And that was exactly what he did. Paul Tuchil Jr. had come a long way since leaving American Chopper. He had rebuilt his life, opened a new shop, and found a new sense of purpose. But despite the success he had found in his new venture, there was still something missing. The journey of rebuilding wasn't just about creating bikes, it was about healing. It was about finding peace and redemption after years of emotional turmoil, public drama, and family conflict. For Paul Jr., the road to redemption wasn't easy, and it wasn't something that happened overnight. But it was a journey that would change everything for him. The truth was, when Paul Jr. walked away from his father's business, it wasn't just about leaving a toxic environment behind. It was also about accepting that there were parts of himself that needed healing. The tension with his father had been a constant source of pain, and walking away from the show didn't immediately fix the emotional scars that had been left behind. For a long time, Paul Jr. tried to push through, focusing on his work, his shop, and his new life. But deep down, he knew that to truly move forward, he had to address the personal issues that had been holding him back for so long. One of the biggest challenges he faced on his road to redemption was confronting the years of strained relationships, particularly with his father. After all, American Chopper had started as a family business. The father and son duo had built an empire together, and yet, over time, their relationship had become more about conflict than collaboration. The constant tension had taken its toll on both of them. And although Paul Jr. had chosen to walk away from the toxic environment, he couldn't ignore the fact that there was still unfinished business with his father. For years, Paul Jr. had wanted to repair the relationship with his dad. He wanted to be able to work together again, to create together, and to rebuild the bond they once had. But he knew that this wasn't something that could happen overnight. Rebuilding a relationship, especially one that had been damaged so deeply, was never going to be easy. There was anger, hurt, and pride on both sides. But Paul Jr. understood that healing required time, patience, and a willingness to let go of the past. It wasn't about forgetting what had happened, it was about finding a way to move forward. As Paul Jr. focused on his new shop, Paul Jr. rebuilt film the fic of sets. Paul Jr. Pain, he was perset. On the fighting ball of Pain designs, he began to realize that his success wasn't just about creating great bikes. It was about creating a life that he could be proud of. He had spent so many years trying to prove himself to the world, to his father, and to the fans of American Chopper. But now he was finally working for himself, creating for himself, and finding joy in the process of designing. This was his second chance, a chance to rebuild his life on his terms. And while it wasn't perfect, it was his. But even with the success of his new shop, there was still a part of Paul Jr. that felt incomplete. He had found success in his work, but the emotional wounds from the past were still there, lingering. He had walked away from the drama, but there was still unfinished business with his father that he had to face. It was clear that true redemption for Paul Jr. wasn't just about building bikes, it was about healing the relationships that had been broken. The turning point in his journey came when Paul Jr. started to see that redemption wasn't just about repairing the past. It was about accepting what had happened and finding peace with it. It was about letting go of the anger, the hurt, and the need for validation. For years, Paul Jr. had been fighting battles. Some of them were external, with the media and the fans, and others were internal, with his father and with himself. But as he moved further into his new life, he started to realize that those battles no longer defined him. He was more than the drama of American Chopper. He was more than the tension with his father. He was his own person, and it was time to let go of the weight of the past. As Paul Jr. continued to focus on his work, he also started to focus on his personal growth. He began to spend more time with himself, doing the things that brought him peace. He reconnected with his love for motorcycles, but he also took time to reconnect with himself. He started to see the importance of self-care, of taking time to reflect, and of letting go of the past in order to embrace the future. It wasn't easy. There were days when he questioned whether he had made the right choice to leave his father's business. But each day, he grew stronger. He learned to trust himself again, to trust his instincts, and to believe in his own abilities. The healing process wasn't just about forgiving his father, it was about forgiving himself. For so many years, Paul Jr. had blamed himself for the breakdown of the relationship with his father. He had believed that if he just worked harder, if he just did things differently, things might have turned out better. But as he moved further along his journey, he began to see that some things were beyond his control. He had done his best, he had worked hard, but sometimes, things just don't work out the way you hope they will. And that was okay. What mattered was that he had learned from the experience, and was now in a place where he could finally move forward. As time went on, Paul Jr. began to see changes not only in himself, but also in his relationship with his father. There were moments of reconciliation, small steps toward healing. It wasn't a perfect process, there were still disagreements, and moments of tension, but the constant fighting had stopped. They had both learned to respect each other's boundaries. Paul's sin may have been a part of Paul Jr.'s past, but he was no longer a source of pain. The relationship was slowly being rebuilt, but this time, it was on more equal ground. There was no longer a need for Paul Jr. to prove himself, he had already done that. Now he was simply living his life the way he wanted. Redemption, for Paul Jr. was not a destination. It wasn't about reaching some end goal. It was about the journey, about learning to accept the past, to forgive, and to move forward with peace. It was about rebuilding his life on his own terms, and in doing so, finding happiness. He had found success in his work, but more importantly, he had found peace within himself. And that was the true reward. Looking back on his journey, Paul Jr. knew that he had been through a lot, but he also knew that he had grown because of it. He had learned valuable lessons about family, forgiveness, and the importance of living for yourself. His road to redemption hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. And as he moved forward, he knew that no matter what came next, he was ready. He had found his way back to the person he was meant to be, and that was the greatest success of all.